Today I'm going to show you a tasty jazz lick that's going to make you sound like a bebop pro over minor 2-5-1 chord progressions. Let's do this thing. What's up, Brent here from Learn Jazz Standards, where we help musicians just like you learn how to play jazz, all while shortening the learning curve, no matter what instrument you play. On this channel, we do lots of jazz theory tips, we do jazz practicing tips and deep dives into jazz standards, as well as jazz improv lessons, just like today's video. So make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell notification button to never miss out on anything that we have going on here. Also, make sure you stick around to the very end, where I'm going to show you 3 ways that you can make sure that you learn this lick very deeply so that you never forget it. All right, so today's lick is over top of a minor 2-5-1 chord progression, and I'm going to teach it to you in concert C minor. So first of all, what's a minor 2-5-1? It's D minor 7 flat 5 to a G7 altered chord to a C minor 7th chord. That's the 1 chord. So D minor 7, G7 to a C minor 7. Now, how do we get that bebop-y sound, that super chromatic, beautiful, jazzy sound over top of this chord progression? Well, that's exactly what this lick does. So let's take a deep dive look into it. But before we do that, of course, let's listen to what it sounds like. Now, a few more times through the lick. Really bebop-y, really chromatic sounding, but what makes it sound like that and what makes this lick so great? Let's slowly walk through this lick. So the very first note is a G natural. Now, the G natural is the 11th of D minor 7 flat 5, but this note isn't actually really the important note. What I'm going to do is identify some target notes within this lick. Now, those target notes in the first chord with the D minor is actually when we get to this F natural. We'll get there in a second, and I'll explain that as well. And then after that, when we get to the G7 alt chord, we come to this F natural as well, which is another one of our target notes. And then we get to this B natural in that same bar with the G7 alt. Again, go over that in a second. And then finally, we have a G natural over top of this C minor 7. So I want to talk about these target notes first, because when we talk about target notes are any note in a jazz line or a musical sentence that we're targeting through other notes, whether it be diatonic or chromatic. So we're arriving to these notes, essentially. That's why we call them target notes. So let's go through this. So we start, like I said, with the 11th, that's G natural. And then we go to an E natural. Now that's technically the 9th of D, but that's really, again, not that important compared to our very first target note, which is the F natural. Now, what is F natural in D minor 7 flat 5? Well, it's the 3rd. Now, the 3rd is another thing that we like to call the a guide tone. It's one of the 2 guide tones in jazz, meaning it's an important note, important chord tone that is going to really help the chord changes pop. And that's really going to make the difference between an amateur sounding jazz line and a professional sounding jazz line. So we're targeting that 3rd to really make that chord pop out really loud at us. Now, something that's really bebop-y that beboppers do all the time is something called enclosure. You have that G natural and then the E natural arriving to the F. So we have a note starting above in pitch from our target note, then below in pitch, that's the E natural, arriving to our target note F. So that's what we call an enclosure, and that's essentially like bebop 101. Like, this is going to come up all the time in bebop. So adding lots of enclosure, we call these approach tones and target notes, it's going to really help make your solo sound like bebop and really jazzy, for lack of better terms. So let's keep going through the line. We go back to that G natural to the A flat. The A flat's kind of important because it's the flat 5 of the D minor 7 flat 5. So it's worthy to note that one. But again, we're heading a certain direction. So now we hit this B natural, which is kind of a little bit strange. because there's not really a B natural within the scale structure of a D minor 7 flat 5. For example, so far this lick is really based a lot off of the Locri and sharp 2, but by adding this B natural, it's almost like it's coming out of the whole half diminished scale. But putting aside scales for a second, I really am thinking about this B natural more as the third of G7, which again, we talked about the third being a guide tone. So it's almost like we're anticipating that G7 alt, and that's a good thing because we're about to do some really chromatic stuff that's gonna make it really sound like bebop. So moving along, now we hit the first note of G7 alt, which happens to be the root. Now the root isn't the most powerful note to hit in a lick, but I don't really think that this note is really structurally grounding. Really, it's moving to our first target note. So we go G to G flat, that's the major seventh, which again, it's not really the major seventh in this line. It's really just what we call a chromatic passing tone, which is arriving down to the target note of F. Okay, now F again. What is F in G7? F is the seventh, the flat seventh to be specific on this dominant seventh chord. Now that is another guide tone, that's the seventh. The thirds and the sevenths are the guide tones. So we're really, again, we're making these chord changes pop, but in a chromatic way, which is really a lot of what's going on in bebop. Continuing down with the chromaticism, we go to an E natural. Okay, E natural. Now this is like really the 13th. A nice extension that you can play over top of dominant seventh chords. But that kind of leads us to the next one, which is the B flat note, which is that's the flat 13. Now this is our first truly altered note that we're dealing with here in the chord. So this is why this is an awesome altered lick. So really adding a lot of tension and release through these altered tones, like that flat 13. But continuing on, now we go to B natural. Now B natural again in a G7 is the third. So that's our next target note, is that B natural. So we're going from hitting that seventh to a bunch of chromatic and altered stuff, but coming back to a grounding center of that third, again, to bring out that chord. But we don't stay there too long. After that, we go to a B flat, which a B flat is actually just the sharp 9, right? The sharp 9, it's that Jimi Hendrix sound, right? Another one of our altered notes, okay? So now we hit the A flat, and the A flat is also an altered note. It's our flat 9. So far we got the flat 13, we got the sharp 9, we got the flat 9, making it a really altered, chromatic, tensiony sort of note. Now finally we land on our last target note, which is the G natural. That's the fifth of C minor seventh, which it's a strong tone. It's not the thirds or the sevenths, so it's not the strongest tone, but it's still totally fine to land on it, especially when we're ending a phrase or a line. So we hit that fifth, and then we end on a color note, the D natural, which is the ninth of C minor seventh. So a beautiful sound. So again, this is what the lick sounds like in totality. So that's the lick. Now, what about some tips for actually learning this lick and never forgetting it? What's the best way to internalize this so it actually comes out in our playing? So number one, the first thing that you can do is to learn it by ear. So instead of looking at notation for this, just learn it by ear. And I guarantee you, even if it's hard at first, that you are absolutely going to learn it a lot better, and it's going to make a lot more sense for you. And then the second thing that you can do is take it through all 12 keys. So bringing it through different key center contexts is going to be incredibly helpful for you just to truly understand it, internalize it even further. And finally, number 3 is actually to take that lick that you learned and find different ways of playing it yourself. So not only will it solidify the anchor that is the lick you just learned, it will help you actually make it into something that's coming from you, which is much more likely to come out when you're playing than something that you have learned verbatim. All right, so now obviously taking this lick and applying it over top of jazz standards is also another really great way to go. So I would highly recommend checking out my free guide, Learn Jazz Standards the Smart Way, where I teach you a 5-step process for learning jazz standards by ear effectively. So check that out at learnjazzstandardsmartway.com, but I'll also leave a link to that on the screen here. And also, hey, if you want to learn some other licks, I have some 3 2-5-1 licks that you'll really find helpful as well. I'll leave a link to that video here on the screen. All right, make sure that you like this video if you found it helpful. Please subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.